Right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we live in a world where we are unable to identify what the truth is. We live in a world where we as a society have gullibly put unwarranted faith in media organizations, in these journalistic institutions to provide us with truthful information. We'd say that in the modern world, because of a combination of profit incentives as well as just the human nature of being perverse in wanting to get news stories that are extremely vulgar, that are extremely inflammatory, we've seen that this notion of journalistic objectivity has created more harm than good. We say that this notion of journalistic objectivity has been bad in 3 ways. But first, let me just clarify to the House what we mean by the notion of journalistic objectivity. What we mean when we're talking about the notion of journalistic objectivity is the societal belief that journalists and journalism are objective. That is to say, the societal belief that the news you get from your news sources is objective news. What does that look like in status quo? It looks like people trusting news organizations to give them the truth. People blindly putting their faith in organizations like Fox News and Breitbart to give them information regarding the truthful state of the world. We'd say at that point then that the 3 characteristics of this journalistic objectivity, which are truthfulness, detachment, and neutrality, have created a huge amount of harm within society. Why has it created harm? And we tell you it's been bad in 3 main ways. It's firstly been bad in the sense that it's harmed activism. Secondly, we'd say it's bad in that it's undermined discourse. And thirdly, we'd say it's bad because it's created a huge power vacuum that leads to a lack of accountability. We tell you then, just to set a parameter for this debate, that opposition has to debate this in a world where this notion exists, because of the fact that they're debating good versus harm. They can't deny that this harm exists. They need to show us why blind trust in these organizations is a good thing. Firstly, then, my first argument as to why this blind trust in these organizations has created an abhorrent moral situation. Firstly, I'd like to explain to you the nature of these organizations. That is to say that these organizations are firms that want to earn profit by selling stories to individuals. We tell you then that to sell that story, they want to make their story as inflammatory as possible. We've seen this with the rise of things like fake news in the modern day. What does this mean? It means that they objectify people suffering and starving in Africa. But we also think that it means that they blame particular minorities. So for example, when you look at Sri Lankan media a year or so ago, when we were blaming Muslim individuals for putting infertility pills in people's food, we say that sort of thing is the inflammatory kind of language and the inflammatory kind of news that is actually put out into this world. Secondly, then, on the nature of these organizations, we tell you that these firms will then always try to be as sensationalist as possible. Why is that bad? Because of the fact that you've now put faith in these organizations, individuals believe that this news that is being, this quote unquote news that is being provided out is true. What does that lead to? It leads to a terrible societal where individuals conflate opinion and fact. What does that do? It undermines discourse because of the fact that you can't have proper discussion. Why now do we say then that you can't have proper discussion? Because there aren't any real facts anymore. Because both the left and the right can claim their opinion to be fact. What does that lead to? It leads to a situation where individuals can't properly communicate. We say that that's bad because that means you don't have individualistic communication. You don't have the ability for people to actually express their ideas. That leads to a situation where you're unable to create proper political discourse, and thereby you can't create change that undermines our system of changing society. And we'd say that that's bad because society is always in need of progress. Secondly, then, we'd say that the idea behind it, so this is a non-contingent argument that isn't contingent on any sort of impact. We'd say that that idea that these firms have to be detached and neutral in itself creates harm. Because of the fact that we say that the expectation of these organizations to be neutral is inherently wrong and immoral. simply because the fact that we say that there are certain issues that it is immoral to take a neutral stance on. So if you're doing a report on black people versus the police, and the police are brutally massacring black people in the streets of America, we'd say then that it's extremely immoral for a news organization to be expected to take the neutral stance. Or when the Yemeni government uses chemical weapons on its own citizens, even then we'd say it's extremely harmful for these news firms to take a neutral stance. That expectation of neutrality says that these organizations should always be detached. That's bad. Why? Because it undermines the role of journalism. Because the role of journalism is to bolster individuals into action. To do that, then you need this idea of rhetoric and emotion. So what has that created? This blind faith in that has created a situation whereby we expect the rhetoric and emotion to be objective. That is to say, we take the rhetoric and emotion and think that that is fact. That leads to the damage I've shown you first. But the expectation of these firms to be neutral itself also creates a situation where you're holding them to a terrible standard that doesn't really exist. And we'd say that that notion in itself is harmful to society just on principle. Thirdly, then, on the nature of these organizations and the trust that we put in them, is to say that this gives credence to certain ideas that don't deserve that credence. Because we say that people, different individuals on different levels of the political spectrum, value different organizations with their same objectivity. But we say that that's simply not true. When Sri Lankan media says that Muslims are putting infertility pills in people's food, for example, we'd say that that's a blatant lie. But now people view those news media outlets as being objective in this. That means that they take this as a valid viewpoint, and that creates harm, such as people harassing Muslims in the street and putting them down. We'd say at that point, this has created literal physical harm to individuals as well, and that's not good.
Point, sir.
Lastly, that it makes people create ideologies around particular news outlets of information, such as Infowars, Breitbart, etc., and see them as objective and factual while the opposite is actually true. What does that create? It creates a cognitive dissonance in society where individuals aren't able to have their proper conversation and talk about it. That leads to them retreating into echo chambers, and I'm going to explain why that's so bad in a bit, but first I'll take your point.
So do you support Twitter's policy of labeling tweets as fake news?
We'd say that that's not the same thing, right? We're not talking about making things objective or not. We're talking about people putting their faith into these organizations. Continuing then, why is that creation of cognitive dissonance inherently bad? Because echo chambers mean that now you aren't able to actually create discourse that have your ideas challenged. That's when you lead to these ideas becoming more and more extreme to the point at which they actually create harm. My second argument then is quite short, and is to show why it gives the government greater control and why that's bad. Because in many countries we say that the government controls media organizations. Thus the media organizations have a very huge bias towards portraying your government well, and people see that as objective. That gives the government the ability to control the national narrative. And that's bad, because that leads to a huge lack of accountability of the government, because the government now decides what is and isn't truth. That means that they control the reality of situation that people experience, and they can use that to, one, hide their failures and make people continue to have faith in a failed system. But secondly, it means that they can target outgroups like minorities and cause them harm. We don't think that this is justified. We prefer a society where individuals are critical of the media, a society where people realize that this is not objective, and a society where people are able to think for themselves. For all these reasons, we support the human spirit side with proposition.
We thank the previous speaker, and we now welcome the first speaker of the opposition.
Can I be heard clearly? Panel, as soon as that proposition tells you that the main issue exists within individuals' lack of cognitive ability, within the individuals' ability to not make decisions in a correct manner, they tell you that the problem is people having blind trust in the journalistic establishment that are journalistic establishments that are profit motivated. And that is a problem with the lack of correct implementation of journalistic objectivity as a whole. We don't think you can pin the blame of all the harms that Ashwin is talking to you about on the direct notion of what journalistic objectivity defines and encompasses. Having said that, there are a few points of recontextualization as to how this objectivity actually plays out in the real world. We tell you on our side of the house, what actually happens in status quo is that journalistic objectivity encompasses three main ideas: neutrality, truthfulness, and detachment. We tell you that neutrality allows the representation of many sides and many narratives that support a specific story. Truthfulness forces all these establishments to go out and research what they're doing properly. Because understand that when Ashwin tells you that people trust these establishments to be unbiased, we tell you that there's a specific pressure on these establishments to make sure that what they're putting out isn't completely false. And that is when you have added responsibility onto the journalistic establishment to make sure that what they're saying is correct. We tell you that when the side proposition tells you that moral implications are completely left out of the narrative, we don't think that's true. We don't think that it's a neutral stance to say that, see, hey, that people are being treated terribly in America, we think that we should do something about it. That is not a biased stance to take. That is simply factual truth, and anyone can see it. And that is the way that it is being reported. Thirdly, understand that truthfulness is linked to neutrality, and neutrality is linked to detachment. The news establishment cannot put out facts and inform its people properly if they are not neutral in specific situations, if they are not detached from the emotional implications of certain situations. And that is when you forfeit your responsibility as an institution as a whole. And that is what people expect of the media. When it comes to our burden, our side would feel that journalistic objectivity has largely benefited society, and those benefits are much more important than side propositions' marginal harms. Having said that, I'll move on to a few points of rebuttal. Let's look at the nature of establishments themselves. On a first level, side proposition tells you that they're extremely sensationalist and they're extremely biased, and people just take their word for granted and take it as fact. Let's assume that this is true. Let's assume that it is true, but even if it was, we tell you that exists in a very small minority of news media. The isolated examples of Fox News tells you this, right? This is not a common phenomena that you see in renowned journalistic establishments. It's an extremely isolated incident. Even if it was true, we tell you that the only reason that Fox News has recently been getting all of its backlash is because people understand that journalistic establishments should remain neutral, should remain factual. That's the only reason you have all the backlash against Fox News in the first place. That would not exist without this notion in place. Secondly, they tell you that being neutral on certain situations is bad and you're ignoring moral implications of things. First, I told you why that was not true in my recontextualization, but even if it were true, we tell you it's not the duty of the news media to spur people into action. It's the duty of news media to give unbiased, reliable information, and people can make whatever they want out of it, right? We don't think news media needs to coerce people in that sense. On the second main branch of argumentation on the harm this does to discourse, they tell you that this creates cognitive dissonance where people conflate ideology with the facts that are provided by news media. We tell you that this is a very small minority, but even if that was true, that polarization that exists, that they claim exists a lot worse and is exacerbated when people do not even have the expectation of news media to remain impartial, do not even have the expectation of news media to provide unbiased information, and they believe that this is the way it should be done, right? Notice how all of side proposition's argumentation relies heavily on some very isolated examples, relies very heavily on a very small minority. At the point at which they don't prove harm in a vast majority of cases, they lose this debate. Having said that, I'll move on to our first argument on the role of journalism as a whole. On a first level, we understand the journalistic establishment is the informant between the public and the government. In order to be listened to by the public should trust you over the word of your own government. And the news media uses its neutrality, uses the fact that it's expected to give out truthful information to its advantage, because that is the only way that you get people to trust you. That is the only way they will trust you over what the politicians are saying on the podium. And that is important because all of this information that you're giving out to the public is what the public then uses to hold governance accountable. And that is the role of the news media. And we tell you that that can only exist when you have this notion in place. And the only reason media is allowed to exist in many countries is because people expect neutrality and expect facts and logic from them. On a second level, when it comes to legitimacy, this encompasses two main areas, firstly on truthfulness and neutrality. When it comes to truthfulness, we told you that in the process that you're gathering this news, because this notion exists in status quo, a vast majority of respectable news media go out of their way to properly research things to make sure that they have the full story in place. Secondly, we've created a culture where misinformation is severely looked down upon. We told you that Twitter is raising concerns about fake news. This is why you have a culture that actively has backlash against misinformation. And that is a safeguard against these isolated examples that side proposition is talking about, because that is the only way those examples are held accountable as well for the way they're misleading people. This is important and beneficial to the people because people make decisions based on the information that they're getting from news outlets. When you have this notion in place, people make the least coerced choices, the least reactionary choices, and therefore better choices on the long term. On the second, based on neutrality, we tell you that when you have this notion in place, you're immediately asked to dissolve personal biases when you're representing stories to the public. This is good because it removes another barrier that is in place for you to deliver the full truth. On a third level, understand that this is also a protection against majoritarian ideology. Facts do not fluctuate with public opinion. The only narrative that exists in news media in the case of governance is that you have people thinking outside the box, have people thinking differently to what your government is saying, and that narrative and that direct opposition to what's going on is extremely important to hold governance accountable. Having said that, all these benefits are derived from journalistic objectivity alone. They will not exist in a world where journalistic objectivity wasn't a thing. Having said that, I'll move on into our second argument on the benefits that this has to people and public discourse. On the first level, it's a protection against the exaggeration that creates panic or reactionary responses to long-term detriment, right? We bring you the example of how people were mass buying due to the COVID-19 pandemic because of social media crossfire, right? The only reason you were able to subdue that is because renowned news establishments brought on board health officials, brought on board economists, and informed people and gave them the facts necessary to quell that panic and to reduce those harmful effects. That does not exist in a world where the news media doesn't have an obligation to be neutral. On a second level, when it comes to discourse, we have much better public discourse on outside the house because people are less polarized. Liberals and conservatives have to face that there are wrong things happening on their own side. They're less likely to be tribalistic. You have all of these benefits that are directly connected to this notion on outside the house. At the point at which they haven't proven sufficient harm, they have lost this debate. We urge you to side with side opposition.
Thank you. We now welcome the second speaker on the proposition side.
Give me a minute. We think the fact that people were unable to, I'm sorry.
Is everything okay, second speaker?
Yeah. The fact that people were unable to subdue Fox Media for the entirety of the Trump election, entirety till Joe Biden was elected, would imply that even though backlash is there, that there are still people who believe in Fox News. There are still people who voted for Trump based on what Fox News reported, and therefore we say whatever backlash that was given against Fox News was not enough to stop it from reporting this fake news, as they say. Therefore, we say that their case doesn't necessarily win primarily on those grounds. But let's move on to rebuttals, right? They said that it's because of the fact that there's an incorrect implementation. We say even if the problem is incorrect implementation, this has inherently led to harms. Whereas you have people going for echo chambers, you have people making coerced decisions, you have people believing news that is wrong under the guise of object. We gave all those harms in Ashwin's speech. So even if it's because of incorrect implementation, we still think that the notion has caused harms, because it's under the notion of objective journalism that these people are creating these harms. But they said that when you're doing something truthfully, it means that there's a pressure to make it right. We think no. We think there's no such pressure simply because of the fact that media is based on how many people follow it, how many people watch the news, basically based on the ratings. We think therefore whatever gives news media corporations the highest ratings is what they will report. We think even in the case of backlash, we say the people who are more likely to get harmed from these kind of motions are those such as minorities. And since they're minorities, we say that the backlash given by these minorities to these media corporations are less likely to be taken seriously, simply on the basis that the majority is still going to be watching them. We give you the example of Fox News, and we say things like this still exist. They spoke about detachment and how when there's no emotional attachment, you're more likely to be true. First of all, we say that there's no such thing as complete detachment, right? We say that individuals are coerced since birth. This means that from the day I was born, first of all, I'm coerced by my gender, I'm coerced by my race, I'm coerced by the school I went to, the ideologies that grew me up, even up to the date what idea of journalism I think. We think the idea of journalism is also inherently subjective to each individual, and we think these are all coercive factors that make journalists coercive, that makes journalists objective. So even if journalists themselves think that they are objective, we say that they aren't, simply on the basis that they just presume they are, meaning that they portray something that they think is accurate. We think this is wrong. But moving on, they talked about the nature of journalism and how there'll be backlash that it's always accurate. We still disagree. We think the nature of journalism is again based on things like sensationalization, which we spoke about, but also we think that even in the case where they do report about something, let's say even if we buy their best argument, which is to say these journalists and these news corporations are objective and they portray a real objective thing, we still think that what this inherently creates is a lack of accountability. That is to say that in the case where a news corporation is completely objective and they say the truth exactly as it is, we think it creates immense harms to society. They came up here and said that it's not the responsibility of journalists and social media to be responsible for these things. But we say they are. In the case where a news media portrays something inherently inaccurately, or they objectify to such an extent that it's insensitive and therefore there's no emotion attached to this means that now individuals have to do the weighing up on their own. What this looks like is the media saying, okay, a black man was killed by the police, but look, there are also black people who commit crimes, so the police could have done it because of the assumption. We say this is objective simply because of the fact that it portrays both sides of the truth. We still think this is wrong because the fact of the matter is that black people are getting killed by the police, that the system has inherently failed them, and there is a system of racism within the United States of America. We think, therefore, by portraying this in that extremely objective manner, the nature of journalism has inherently caused harm to black people, right? Why? Because you now refuse to take into consideration the emotions of these individuals involved, and you leave it to the individuals how to interpret. Now, white people in society have an excuse to say that, look, it's not our fault. News says it like this. This means it's not really the black people's fault. We argue with that theory of rationality and say that individuals aren't always rational. Instead, individuals are also coerced. They have their own biased judgments. That's why they easily believe what news says. So even as an individual, I see something and I think it's wrong, I'm more likely to watch the news that kind of agrees with my ideology. That is to say, if I'm a white supremacist, I'm so more likely to watch things like Fox News because I think Fox News is right, simply because of the fact that I think it matches my ideologies and narratives. We think that premise on this ground that human beings are inherently irrational and they want what's best is wrong. They spoke about how the truth doesn't fluctuate between you. We think it does. We think a few years ago, if you had asked people whether black people were getting brutalized by the police, they would disagree and say, no, there's equality in both sides. But within the reason now you have this out there is because you have social media, etc., all reporting on the truth, on what exactly looks, on what's happening right now in the world. We say that the only reason you kind of have a good enough social response to inequalities happening is because different media corporations portray different aspects of the truth, and therefore individuals see this and are capable of grasping what they think is right. But moving on, they spoke about how there's protection against exaggeration and how these people bring in professors, etc., who are researched on these subjects, and this is the more like a creative discourse. We still think that while this is an extremely good benefit, that there's still harms, right? Because media inherently exaggerates everything. So even if a person dies, they portray their family, they portray what this person did. We think everything they show is inherently an exaggeration. But even if we say that they don't exaggerate, that there's protection against exaggeration, we still think that the very fact that you're trying to portray this in an objective manner still does harms. Inherently, what we're saying is, even if you portray it objectively, even if you're doing it under guise of objectivity, you still end up encouraging people to go towards echo chambers. You still end up pushing people to form their own narratives, and therefore we say it's harm. On the idea of Twitter, we say that even the reason why Twitter takes such a long time to label something as fake news, even if they do, means that Twitter themselves has an idea of what they consider objective. We think Western ideas of objectivity are quite contrasting to things what people in countries like Saudi Arabia or even countries like India consider objective. We think objectivity is a perception, and therefore Twitter themselves have their own idea of objectivity. Therefore, we say objectivity is never achieved. But moving on to my argument, right, which is to say that this makes society a worse place. Here we say that first of all, media is completely politicized and usually portray the idea of the majority. We say this is simply because of the fact that they need ratings, and therefore they are more likely to sensationalize things to get a higher reaction, and they give people what they think they need. Media doesn't tell the truth, but instead tells what they think will people react to more. Therefore, we say they're more likely to focus on the majority simply because of the fact that the majority means it's a higher number of people. But moving on, this means that you now portray the minority completely wrong, or you show them as insignificant. What this then results in things like a Muslim doctor being accused of making Sri Lankan women infertile, and therefore we say that this inherently portrays minorities in a wrong way. But this is also wrong. We say this simply because of the fact that when it was proven that this Muslim doctor didn't really make women infertile, the news didn't really report this. That is because things that create discourse are less likely to create the kind of attention, the ratings that news media wants. Therefore, we say news media doesn't want this kind of discourse. But also we say this is harmful because now these individuals, these minorities, have to depend on international media. That is to say, they are now alienated from society, from the majority, simply on the basis that they are not part of the social narrative. That is, that the media doesn't cover to them, the media doesn't cater to them, and therefore we say this makes social dilemma much worse side by side.
Thank you. We now welcome the second speaker of the opposition side.
Destroy. Am I audible?
Yes.
Side proposition loses this debate when they fail to understand that journalistic objectivity depends on three intrinsically connected things: truthfulness, neutrality, and detachment. The point at which they fail to prove the harms of all three of these aspects of journalistic objectivity, they lose this debate. But in addition to that, the moment they base their entire case on how this solely affects society, and they fail to understand that the purpose of journalistic objectivity and the entire notion of it in itself directly benefits journalism as a whole, that is where we win this debate. Two questions on which the debate boils down to that I'll deal with before my argument on how this affects the perception of the media. First question of the role of journalistic objectivity. First, if they talk about that the problem is with people believing what the media says, and there's cognitive dissonance. Firstly, a complete lack of link between why objectivity is actually connected to people's cognitive dissonance, which my first speaker also pointed out. But then the second speaker comes up and makes a concession that people listen to Fox News because that is the news that tells them what they want to believe. And that is why they lose this debate. because this cognitive dissonance exists when you only listen to media that tells you what you want to hear. Media that does not uphold these three principles of truth, neutrality, and detachment. All these three principles which Fox News in itself does not uphold. And in addition to that, these are the very people who listen to a president who labels any other legitimate news source, an objective news source, as fake news. And that is exactly where the problem of cognitive dissonance exists. It's a problem within what type of news source they're listening to, not a problem with journalistic objectivity, and that is where they lose that first level. Second level on how but even if, say, it were a problem with cognitive dissonance, we deal with it better on our side of the house. Because the moment you entrust state in these journalistic institutions, the moment you place this added burden on maintaining truth and whatnot, that is when you have some form of public pressure to make sure the information that's coming out is accurate in the first place. And in addition to that, when they talk about how, this was on my second level, when they talk about how their sole motive of journalistic institutions is profit motive and more views. It that exists, that incentive plays far more when journalistic objectivity exists, because you understand that being objective and having facts caters to all demographics, not because with Fox News and whatnot, they solely cater to the conservative mindset, whereas any credible news source would display that, oh look, this country has a death rate of X amount of percentage with COVID-19 rates and whatnot, which doesn't play into beliefs of people. That is when your demographic is wider, and that is when your profits are wider, you still have journalistic objectivity even with profit motive. And in addition to that, when they talk about how there comes an issue with moral implications, firstly, no, sir, they fail to respond to Chirapi's contextualization about how moral implications are coming to this debate. But in addition to that, it's far worse than that of the house, because they're allowing journalists, because when you remove journalistic objectivity from the question, you allow people to justify what type of morals are more important. That is when something is so subjective as morals come into question, where you allow news sources to paint out black people as conserving news sources to paint out black people as the enemy here, and you have liberal news sources that play out the police force as the problem here. Whereas in an objective journey, when journalistic objectivity exists, you would rather paint out the rate of police brutality rather than use language of bigotry and whatnot within it. And that in itself, we fulfill our role as journalists themselves, because one, we're carrying out truth in our articles, we're carrying out neutrality in our articles. The point at which they fail to deal with these three aspects of journalistic objectivity, they lose this debate. Second question on who actually creates more benefit to society. Firstly, they talk about the impact it has on minorities. It's kind of ironic they decided to choose minorities because it shoots themselves in the foot. Because we brought you that objectivity is something that is constant. Because the problem, all the examples and problems they brought up are of news organizations that don't practice journalistic objectivity. Which is a problem with the practicality and the implementation of it, and not with the notion. So when you have objectivity and truth that exists irrespective of what the popular belief is at that point, that is when you don't start targeting minorities, and that is when you don't concede to majoritarian views. This directly contributes to the amount of discourse you can have in society, because you have this majoritarian toxic narrative of say in Sri Lanka, where you're blaming Muslims for the COVID virus, whereas now you have news media sources that are using statements from the public health department that say, look, it is the cause of a virus that spread through DNA and whatnot, which directly contrasts this popular narrative. But in addition to that, when they talk about how sensationalization undermines history, that is when they fail to draw the link between how journalistic objectivity, and that is the truthfulness, neutrality, and detachment directly linked to sensationalization. Because sensationalization exists when you exaggerate the truth. That exaggeration does not exist when you have objectivity and you're forced to put out facts. In addition to that, we told you how it proportionately controls the amount of panic you have in society when you don't sensationalize media and numbers that only can exist when the notion of objectivity exists. But in addition to that, we brought you the tangible benefit of how we don't create this culture of polarization or political parties which leads to better discourse. Because on that house, the strongest point and the only harm is the fact that people believe and trust in these news sources without any doubt. They fail to understand the context at which this trust exists. Is a small minority of people who trust subjective news sources and not journalistically objective news sources. And when they fail to draw that link, they lose their entire debate. This moves me on into my argument on the perception of media. Your point, ma'am.
Ma'am, considering the fact that in a lot of countries the state controls media and can thus control those narratives, why then do you think we should hold those narratives with the same credence as other narratives?
Well, you fail to listen to a majority of my speech on journalistic objectivity means that you aren't controlled by the state. You are entirely neutral. The notion of objectivity consists of neutrality, and that means you aren't swayed by parties whether or not it's government. Any example you bring of the states controlling the media is not under the notion of objectivity. It's because there's a lack of objectivity as a whole. That is why you lose this debate. First, this moves an argument on the perception of the media. Because the moment you maintain the legitimacy of the media by maintaining the subjectivity, my first speaker expanded on this, that is when it's harder for governments to use the media as scapegoats. That is when it's harder for governments to pin the media as carrying out misinformation when they're actually legitimate sources. Because now there exists this sense of public trust in objective media sources, which means that any policy that government pass in terms of censorship, in terms of anti-journalistic practices, in terms of killing investigative journalists, now you are able to hold governments accountable in that context because you now have trust in objective journalistic institutions. At the point at which these are unique benefits that cannot exist when the media sources don't depend on things like truth and neutrality. That is when your journalists themselves are harmed. In the long run, because we proved to you why there's no connection between your cognitive dissonance and objective and journalistic objectivity, because I proved to you how journalistic objectivity gives you unique benefits on our side of the house, because the only problem with journalistic objectivity was the lack of implementation of it. We are so proud to oppose.
Thank you. We now welcome the third speaker on the proposition side.
Could I have a minute, please?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Can I be seen also?
Yes.
All right.
Would you prefer that we turn off our videos? Is your internet connection okay?
No, I think it's stable now.
Okay, cool.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Honored panel, I believe side opposition loses the debate when they clearly fail to read the motion properly, and they clearly fail to understand the arguments brought out by us. We, in our first speaker stated, and throughout our cases, we have stated that the notion of journalistic objectivity exists, but we never stated that journalistic objectivity itself exists. Throughout their arguments, they have brought out points regarding why journalistic objectivity is good, but we have proven to you that it doesn't exist. So any good that it does also doesn't exist. We have proven to you why the notion of journalistic objectivity is bad for society as a whole, which was our burden of proof. And this is why we win the debate, because we clearly are debating on the right topic, and we clearly have countered all their arguments while they have not countered any of us. Firstly, moving on to our first argument, moving on to my clash points, like firstly, which side debates the right motion, and secondly, which is beneficial to all the stakeholders. Firstly, on our side, we clearly stated that we suggest the notion of journalistic objectivity exists, but not the fact that journalistic objectivity is true. The difference between something's notion existing and that something existing is two different things. We stated out here that many news sites such as Fox News use the notion of journalistic objectivity to relay false news and biased news. They say that they are unbiased, they say they're truthful, and they say that they're using a detached tone. But that is all just a notion that they're presuming, because the people actually buy this notion and is what leads to harm to the society, and they've clearly failed to understand that concept. Also, an entire argument on our side, how the lack of government accountability was not actually understood by their side and not rebutted properly. On our side, we stated that governments have control over organizations, and they simply stated that if a firm is journalistically objective, the government won't have any control of it. And then they come out here and bring out things such as journalists being killed and censorship, and we say that that's completely that's a clash between their own points, because they give out why the journalists should not support the government, and then they bring out what would happen if they don't support the government in extreme cases. We find out that their examples of journalists being killed in Saudi Arabia is actually one of the main reasons why on our side, as we've proven to you, why journalists and all these notions actually support the government. And this in turn supports our second argument, why this leads to a lack of government accountability, because media in China and media in certain Middle Eastern countries are nothing more than a figurehead for the government's propaganda. And we have proven to you why this is detrimental to society, and they clearly haven't really argued with any of our points. On our first argument about the notion of journalistic objectivity, we reiterated time and time again why it is the notion that we're debating, not whether journalistic organizations are actually objective or not. And even if we give them the benefit of doubt, even if we take it from their point of the paradigm, we have clearly rebutted all their points by proving out that the harm of journalistic objectivity, even if it exists, is much more than these so-called benefits they're bringing out. They bring out the fact that these organizations will bring out more truthful news, and this will lead to less fake news as brought out by the explosion of Fox News. But what we say is that Fox News faced backlash when it supported Trump, not because it portrayed incorrect observations. On our side of the paradigm, we have explained to you why when we remove this notion of journalistic objectivity, we do not sell lies to the people. We tell you that, all right, Fox News is biased. They are biased towards Trump. But what we are saying is not supposed to be objective. We are not hiding behind this veil of objectivity that says that we are saying the truth and Trump is right. We are saying that, okay, we are not truly objective, but Trump is right according to us. And also we have proven to you why objectivity doesn't exist. In case I need to reiterate this, as the points made by my second speaker, each of us from birth has a bias due to our race, gender, sex, or any other obligations or assumptions that we have made on our own. And therefore, the entire third point that they brought out about detachment and unbiasedness falls flat, because as stated by us, each individual is born with an inherent bias, and it is almost impossible to get rid of this, and especially in the terms of a journalist, when they have to cater news to very opinionated people, as told on our side of the paradigm, where you have to send news to people who will have different opinions. You have to send news that is relevant, where people have two contrasting ideologies, and it is impossible for you also as a human being not to have one side of the argument that you support when you are casting this information. On our side of the they also bring out this thing that contradicts their own point. They say that how objective news results in experts being called out to consolidate the pieces of news that they present. This goes against the entire premise, because if the news outlet was truly unbiased, if the news outlet did not support said things, not right now, they instead of bringing out only one person of expert in that field to consolidate their news, they would have brought in other people. Suppose they were talking about climate change. They bring out a scientist who has decades of research regarding why climate change is real. And they've said, okay, we stated this, but since we are journalistically objective, what they actually had to do was bring in a person who claims the complete opposite, because then that is true journalistic objectivity, because that is true unbiasedness. Then they are providing both sides of the argument and not simply facts on why their news is true. And this, we say, is an extreme contradiction on their case, which is one of the reasons why they lose the debate. On our side of the paradigm, we have shown you how our side, the motion of this journalistic objectivity is detrimental to society, to the journalists, to the government, and to the people actually watching the news. And we've also gone ahead and given you the even if detriments of this motion, that even if journalist objectivity was actually true, even if we took them on the best case scenario, where we have everyone actually being journalistically objective, which is impossible, we find so many detriments, and these detriments are not enough to outweigh the benefits that you receive on our side, where everyone sheds this notion of false journalistic objectivity, where everyone, when news outlets just come out here and say, all right, we side with these Yemen people who are being gassed by their own government. We side with these people in terms of famine. We side with the Black lives and we support the Black Lives Matter, because we are not unbiased, because we understand that human emotion is something that cannot be taken out from such pieces of news. They clearly haven't rebutted the first argument made by Ashwin, where he said that some issues cannot be stated in an unbiased way. They have just skipped over that argument. And I tell you that this is extremely true, because journalistic objectivity especially falls in such issues where you have to support one side, where one side has the clear moral high ground, and where you cannot spread lies regarding the black people who are actually suffering. On our side of the paradigm, we have proven to you why we are actually debating the right topic, why we have actually even gone ahead and given you the even if detriments of the motion, and why on our side of the paradigm, our benefits far outweigh any of the so-called negatives that they bring out from a false motion, which is why side proposition should win the debate. Thank you.
Thank you. We now welcome the third speaker on the opposition side.
Can I be heard if I speak at this level?
Yeah.
Go. The moment that the third speaker comes up and says that they have this inherent big problem with the veil of objectivity, what they're necessarily saying is that they concede that objectivity is good and they wish there was more of it. We win on our side of the house, right? But also, we want to say that there was this complete misunderstanding of the motion, and because of that, let's read it for you today, right? The motion specifically says the notion of journalistic objectivity. This means the concept of journalistic objectivity, the idea of journalistic objectivity, not if it was good or bad, if people falsely believe that these media outlets had this journalistic objectivity. Because the brunt of their argumentation hinges so much on this mischaracterization of the motion we win as soon as Ashwin came up here and contextualized this debate for us today. But also notice that they did not engage with the burden that we pushed about how, if they wanted to show that things like journalistic objectivity weren't good, they had to show us what the problem with truth, what the problem with neutrality, and the problem with detachment were. They failed to do this. They failed to win this debate for you today. And to be honest, I'm going to be honest here, right? Because of the mischaracterization of the motion that side proposition hinged upon, I have only one main cash point for you today, and which side fulfills their burden better. So now I'm just going to read this. Right? A huge brunt of the argumentation relied on people having this blind faith of objectivity. What we are debating here is the notion and the concept of journalism. They fail there, right? And not if people should be blindly believing of this objectivity, right? So therefore, every single harm that they brought for you today relied on the wrong implementation of this motion. All the harms that they brought to you today relied on the fact and the lack of objective of journalistic objectivity, and because of that they lose this debate. But and notice that they didn't have any real harms, because on their paradigm everything that they brought to you was this blind and lack of objectivity, which clearly concedes the fact that objectivity has so many benefits and not enough harms, right? But we came up here and told you, right, that all of their let's take them on their contextualization of the debate. All the harms of these new media has been falsely portrayed as objective, and when they weren't essentially objective, right? We believe that one, it's not as big as they portray. People are inherently smart enough to realize when things aren't right. But even if they believe certain things because of their ideological and personal cognitive dissidence, we think that cognitive dissidence doesn't exist within the paradigm of this debate, because people go to places like Fox News to essentially be told and a confirmation bias, not because they want things like to be, not because they want to know news and whatnot, right? But even if that was the case, and they still went on the ideological bias and believe that the ideological bias was true, we on our side, we deal with that whole problem, because these ideological biases aren't perpetuated on our side of the house through journalism. We're not telling these people that their ideological biases are true because we will be more objective. They're essentially telling you that this is problematic, it's wrong, and you should not believe. That's what happens on our side of the house. But then there was this one point which we will give to side proposition, that they came up here and actually engaged with motion and told you that there are just some instances that it's immoral to be objective. But we already rebutted this entire thing about immorality when we told you that that reporting happens on a rational view. So when you come up and say that, listen, this black man was killed because of police brutality, we tell you that's not essentially a moral calculation. That is telling you the truth. On our side of the house, that's perpetuated. On their side of the house, they would play to these ideological biases, and we wouldn't be objective. So then the policeman would be sympathized with. That's not what we want on our side of the house. But also, I want to tell you that they fail to respond to not even a branch of our argumentation, but all of our argumentation, right? They fail to engage with us on how, when you give the truth and you're neutral, it takes away the ability for these news sites to be to exaggerate their news. This is a direct benefit of that is resulted through journalistic objectivity, because it results in proportionate responses. This means that things like flocking to your nearest supermarket to buy toilet paper and panicking doesn't happen, because we told you the truth of the instance. You are going to have a proportionate response. They didn't engage with how we create more discourse, and we essentially reduce tribalism, because now that we're objective of things like political parties, then the truth and what's wrong about these political parties is sort of highlighted within the scope of the debate, right? But also, let's say that they did come up here and give you proper harms of the concept of journalistic objectivity. Even if that happens, we told you that they only looked at the way journalistic objectivity affects people. We, on our side of the house, told you that journalistic objectivity benefits the people and benefits journalists. Therefore, because we took more stakeholders than them, we automatically have far more benefits on our side of the house. Therefore, when this motion reads journalistic objectivity has more harms than benefit, we proved to you that wasn't true. We proved to you essentially that this concept and notion of objectivity has far more benefits, right? We told you how now journalists gain more of an income because now they're essentially profit motivated. So now that they've been notorious for things like objectivity and the truth, that means more people will hire them to essentially
write about certain topics, it profits them. We also told you how people, how it impacts people and how they are no longer forced and panicked into responses that will only be harmful. We told you on our house how people, now that we give you proper educated and factual evidence of certain things, this allows you to have a more educated response. That means when you make choices of media, it's proper choices that won't affect you in a wrong way because you've been told the truth, right? They just refuse to sort of talk to you about on our contextualization and how they had mischaracterized this motion. But we told you that even if you bought their contextualization, we still win because we have far more benefits for two of the most important stakeholders on our side of the house. So but let's take them on their best case scenario, and which is obviously on their contextualization of this. It's bad that societies have this false sense of objectivity. We think we've been here because they essentially concede to the fact that there is so many benefits, and their only problem is the fact that these benefits can't be achieved because of the fact that there's a lack of it or a false sense of it. We won this debate from the very beginning. We sincerely urge you to side with side opposition.
Thank you. And we now move on to the reply speeches, beginning with the opposition reply.
Can I be heard at this forum?
Yeah.
Panel, journalistic objectivity does not just exist in the way people view the media. It exists in the role that the media takes upon itself and the practices that it takes into consideration when it engages with the public. A complete lack of engagement on the way it actually affects the media and thereby affects the people that they are so concerned about. At the point at which all their benefits hinge on this small minority of cognitively malfunctional bigots, they lose because they do not prove harm to a magnitude that counters the benefits that we have been talking to you from the very get-go. Having said that, side proposition loses on those grounds alone. But even then, there is one main question in today's debate. Are the importance enough to outweigh whatever magnitude of harm we're talking about? Let's take side proposition on their best case. We believe we have given sufficient rebuttal to deal with why a lot of these points simply do not exist. But let's assume you bought all of that content. Let's assume that still stands. They told you three things. There's cognitive dissonance, and there's biases, and there's no moral calculation that goes into your reporting. And thirdly, you create for bad discourse because people are convinced that what they're seeing on the news is facts. Understand that they did not impact this in a way that directly affects society. They have not painted out the impacts that all of what they're talking about has on society. Therefore, they haven't shown you the harms that they are so concerned about. At the point at which they haven't done that, that does not apply. Even if you were to think that they had implemented this enough, that they have painted out a sufficient picture, even then, it's an extremely small minority of cases that you're talking about. The kind of people who watch Fox News, right? We tell you that we dealt with that from the very start. You should discredit all of that. Contrast that to our benefits that we have on our side of the house. From the very beginning, I told you that this affects the way that media outlets conduct themselves, the way they go out and research, the kind of people that they bring onto panels on news media, the kind of things that they do in general, right? It offers a neutral and unbiased perspective in a world that's run a mass with so many other characterizations, with so many other dominant narratives, right? We told you why that is of utmost importance. Secondly, we told you why this is the only reason the media is even legitimate in the first place. It's the only reason you watch the news in the first place. It's because they provide opposition to your government. It's because they provide the facts on what is actually happening. You know you can trust them. And that is why that solidifies the magnitude of importance that the media has in society. Thirdly, earlier we told you that you get much better discourse on outside the house because people are forced to confront all the nitty-gritties and make their own ideologies more susceptible to being questioned by the other side. They're much more likely to engage in debates with the other side because you face better, more factual information. Understand that their main burden to prove in the House today was to tell you how truth, neutrality, and disattachment from what's happening in status quo is inherently detrimental to the journalistic process, why that in itself as a notion has significantly harmed society. They have not done that. And if you compare that to all the significant benefits that we have spoken to you about on a purely utilitarian principle, because we have been able to prove that all of our benefits affect a massive magnitude of people. When you brought you examples of panic buying, examples of how this affects all the decisions you're making, examples of how this actually affects people on the ground, we have given you a much more plausible and much more convincing picture of how this benefits people. At the point at which all of that applies and their small minority of harm exists, we believe that we have won the major calculus of this debate. We believe that journalistic objectivity has done much more good than it has done harm. For all these reasons, we strongly urge you to side our position.
Thank you. And we now welcome the last speaker of the debate, the proposition reply speaker.
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Right. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. Shruti can claim all that she wants that we didn't reply to their 3 main ideas, that being detachment, neutrality, and truthfulness. But note that my case from the very start was based on the idea as to why these ideas of neutrality, truthfulness, and detachment are inherently immoral even on a non-contingent, right? That is to say that even if we considered that their side interpreted the motion correctly, which we don't, we still think that we win. And I'm just going to tell you the analysis that we gave now because I still don't feel that they've properly tackled it. Why are detachment and neutrality then bad? We said that it's bad because that's what leads to social dissonance and that's what leads to a sense of immorality. Because we say it's inherently immoral to be neutral in a situation where black people are being gunned down by the police. It's inherently immoral to stand by and be neutral when the Yemeni government is harming its own citizens. We say at that point that neutrality and detachment creates a huge amount of social dissonance that makes people less likely to act out and makes people less likely to take a call to action. Why then did we also tell you that truthfulness isn't always a good thing? I gave you this analysis and Anugi reiterated it, where we told you that truthfulness isn't always what leads to the most social justice and what leads to the most social benefit. Because when you look at crime statistics of black people, sure, they might be better, but what they're going to do is they're going to incite more violence on black people by police. We'd say at that point, we clearly showed you why even when you are objective and when you are truthful, it still leads to a huge amount of harm. We'd rather prefer a society where individuals are able to know that this information isn't truthful and know that this information isn't objective. We'd say at that point, we won this debate. What were the main clashes then in this debate? Firstly, the first clashes were on these ideas of detachment, neutrality, and truthfulness. The second clash, I'd say, would be whether or not it leads to more or less freedom in society, that is to say freedom of things like conversation, information, whether it detriments the overall system of communication within society. I've shown you why on our side we win that idea of detachment, neutrality, etc. But I also tell you that all of the benefits that they give on their side of those 3 factors doesn't stand. Because when you have those things like detachment, looking at the problems I've given you with it, we'd say at that point, when you're inciting violence against minorities, it doesn't matter that you're upholding some principle of journalistic integrity when people are getting shot in the street and killed. We'd say at that point that doesn't count. Secondly, then, which side actually contributes to maintaining the state of communication? Firstly, let's note the fact that I still don't think that they probably responded to when I told you about the fact that this social preference, or this social notion rather, allows individuals to conflate opinion and fact, creating cognitive dissonance. That leads to extreme problems like echo chambers, that leads to extreme complications where you can't communicate ideas between the political left and right because they have different definitions of what a fact is. We'd say at that point, you're undermining discourse. And I showed you why that was bad in first, because that undermining of discourse means that you can't create social change. They still haven't responded to that idea. Lastly, we'd say that on our side, it's better because it gives credence. On their side, you give credence to ideas that don't deserve it. Because the fact that we told you that certain organizations' ideas aren't as valuable or aren't as valid as other organizations' ideas, extremely bigoted ideas, extremely closed-minded ideas. Those ideas don't have as much social worth as other ideas, and to say that they should be treated at a neutral value and to be treated as objective is inherently wrong. Lastly, then, why didn't they respond? Lastly, then, I tell you that they didn't respond to an idea of government control, where you now give the government an ability to hurt the outgroup, to hurt minorities within the state, to police the lives of individuals, and to make sure that they cover up their own failure, creating a lack of accountability and room for the state to fail further and humiliate its citizens. We'd say at that point, where the side that's not only read the motion correctly, where the side that's crossed over to opposition's paradigm and debated their side correctly. At that point, we'd say we've won on all grounds, side with the proposition, let this motion stand. Thank you.
Thank you very much.